glass ceiling might be cracked, but it has not shattered. The woman's ability to advance into a male-dominated society is shunned by the inevitable biological urgency of pregnancy, and that's what we hope to change on our side. What we hope to achieve is a better inclusive world where females and males both are able to live a progressive lifestyle and that they can choose whether they actually want a child or not. That's the kind of time and opportunity that we're going to be providing on proposition. 3 things upon my speech. First, I'm going to talk about who we should protect. Second, I'm going to talk about the solvency and why we're able to maximize accessibility. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about why it's the state's obligation to do so. But before I explain those, 3 pieces of framing. First, in terms of what this motion actually means, we would say what embryo testing and freezing literally means is that you're able to freeze embryo, and that's to say sperm or egg cells, and make sure that they can be retained at a young, healthy level. Upon our model, we would say that we are happy to provide subsidies for research institutions, like sponsor them, and so that investors can easily opt into this new market. And thirdly, we're more than happy to enhance campaigns so that normal individuals, even from any kind of socioeconomic statuses, are going to have access to this, and they're going to be aware of this news. Given that, first, who we think we have to protect. Because I think it's important to recognize that what we hope to actually save on our side are the vulnerable. That's to say that what we do want to support is the diverse choices of lifestyles in the 21st century, where there's many genders, where there's many forms of living, and that's what we hope to protect on our side. But the problem in the status quo is basically twofold. First is what's going on when women are trying to integrate into a male-dominant patriarchal society. We think what happens is that even if they're trying to integrate within any kind of corporation and trying to reach executive branches, they need to spend basically their times when they were 20 to 30 into actually going to a corporate and working there to make sure that they could gain trust from the company. This means that they are not able to have the sufficient time to to spend time and labor on their private life because they need to use all their time on work. We think this also similarly applies for men because there's a trend of progressive forms of working that a lot of males want to save a lot of money before they actually get a child. The common problem here is that they're not able to establish a good private life and work life at the same time. But second is that the biggest context within this debate is the high barrier to actually accessing these kinds of technologies. That's to say, currently, because of the high cost of these products, it's extremely exclusive, which means that only the rich are able to access it. We say that on our side, we think we're able to actually cover this ground because everyone's gonna know and have higher and easier cost, access to these. We think we're able to actually try to reverse the biological element of women because we provide more time. Given that, 4 things upon how we are able to maximize accessibility and change things for the better on our side. First, as I mentioned earlier upon the high barrier access, we're able to actually reasonably bring down the price. That's to say that when the state is the one that's going to be implementing R&D, that means that supply is going to go up, and then which means that the cost is going to go down. This is based on the logic because when there's going to be a lot of sponsorships, a lot of new methods of incorporating technology, better ways of actually enhancing the supply chain and including more investors within it. We think that just simply means that the price is going down, just like any other big technology did with green technology or computers in general. We think this means that you're able to limit any kind of potential side effects that can occur because the credibility of any kind of research and data goes up because you're able to implement more trial and error. But second, and very importantly, is that you're able to bring out safer pregnancies. I have 4 layers upon this. First is because you're able to delay pregnancies. That's the same, the status quo and a biological aspect. When you're reaching 30 to 40, the number of cells and the quality of cells drastically goes down. On our side, when you're able to freeze these kind of cells, what's going to happen is that you're going to make sure that you can retain these healthy young cells so that even when you're 30 to 40, you're actually able to incorporate it and actually make sure that the cell doesn't kind of break down. That's the kind of thing we could delay. But second is that even if these kind of pregnancies are going to fail, you're going to have a lot of embryo testing that are still freeze. This means that you can easily transfer this many times without any harm to the woman's body. And we think that's extremely important because there's no other method to do so in the status quo. Thirdly, is upon terms on females who might have like uterus like cancer, or even for males, so basically for the people who need radiation or chemotherapy for certain instances. These kind of radiation and kind of harmful like substances usually drastically like decreases the effectivity and kills a lot of these cells. If you're able to transfer these cells before you undergo chemotherapy or radiation, you're able to make sure that there's going to be no harm to these cells, and make sure that after you go through like radiation or chemotherapy, these cells are going to be retained. Fourthly, is because you're able to pre-implant genetic testing. That's to say that currently, throughout these kind of like freezing, technology is able to see through testing whether these embryos include some pieces of DNA of like genetic disorders. We think this means that you're able to actually seed out and make sure that you can screen out these kind of problems. Therefore, we think upon these 4 layers, we're able to provide safe pregnancies. Thirdly, then, what kind of benefit? Thirdly, because it's just in terms of societal impacts. That's to say, you're psychologically better able to opt into the system. Because the mindset to use this is going to drastically go down, because your neighbors, your family is going to do this. Just in the same way that infertility treatment was not seen very positively until there was a lot of subsidies and a lot of social awareness to it, we think just in the same way, like women are going to easily be able to opt into the system. Fourthly, we say the educative effect, where like everyone is going to be able to know about this technology, where everyone's not going to be excluded from the lack of access to information and going to be regretting their decisions in the future, is extremely important. Impact, we think that means that women are likely to not rush into their choices, because they know that they have more time and opportunity to think if they want a child. Fourthly, we think in an aging society, this is extremely important, because the state has a responsibility of making the environment sustainable. And that impact is going to bring me to why it's a state's obligation. First, because we think they need to be the ones advocating for progressive change. I think that it needs to be the states that keep on changing based on social trends, whether it's gender or environment or nanotechnology, just in the same way we think that women, like the state, has an obligation of providing better progressive. We also think this is going to be a form of compensation for women because of the past discrimination and the fact that they can't enter the market or any kind of STEM field so easily. We think in that way, the state has an obligation of providing the best option for women that they could do in the future. We will also say it's a terrible idea for the private market to do so, because they could basically just do price gouging and make sure that it's going to be exclusive for certain individuals. On our side, if we make it a public utility, then everyone is going to have easy access to it. The government is going to know what's going to happen. They're able to monitor how the society and the political impact or societal or economic impacts is going to have. Therefore, we think it can only be the state, and that's why I'm so happy to shatter the glass ceiling.
Firstly, I want to talk about what happens to mothers who have a choice in the status quo. Second, I want to talk about what happens to mothers who don't have a choice in the status quo. But before moving on to that, just some clarification about this problem of risk that the leader opposition is concerned about. 3 responses. Firstly, notice this argumentation about risk is inherently an assertion and is not entirely mechanistic in nature. Compare that and weigh this against Sena's mechanistic reason to plausibly believe why it is the case that research and development will take place on our side of the house. Why is it the case that there is significantly, gradually less and less risk of that technology? And secondly, notice when state promotes any kind of medical option, they necessarily provide a reparation in case it fails. Recognize in case of COVID vaccine, state, majority of countries, do provide reparation in case it fails. Thirdly, recognize that doctors are likely to inform patients of the kind of risk. Obviously, they know for sure what they're going through. So I think this risk argument is incredibly absurd. Okay, firstly, what happens to mothers who have a choice? And I think this is critical to note that the dismal lack of comparative on the leader of opposition's argument. Because they say companies are going to pressurize women to take this option. What happens on that side? What happens on that side is the companies are probably going to pressurize women, especially career women, to take an option of abortion if they are already pregnant. That is the most likely comparative. I just want to note that, especially in the context of West, it is unlikely that the companies are going to pressurize these women to actually take this option in an explicit manner. So I just want to note that on their side, there are only 2 options for the vast majority of women, given that the middle-class women oftentimes cannot have access to this option of embryo freezing technology in the status quo because it's incredibly expensive. So the first option that they have is abortion, right? Now, recognize that abortion is harmful for 2 reasons. One is that there are enormous psychological harm that comes with the process of abortion. Not just the fact that you feel like you're killing a life, and not just a life, your child's life, but the psychological harm that comes with abortion is more than that, right? It comes from both the process of before going through abortion and after going through abortion. So, for example, you're gonna be horrified when you see the image of a unborn child being killed, for instance. When you Google it, you're gonna be horrified. But also recognize that, talking to your family about, whether you're thinking about, taking an abortion as an option, oftentimes results into bad consequences. Oftentimes your family, your parents especially, may not be as understanding as you hope them to be, because your parents really are obsessed with with the idea of having grandchildren, for example. So recognize that oftentimes these kind of process of abortion tends to be incredibly psychologically traumatic for the vast majority of women. But secondly, abortion is just irreversible. Even if you regret it later on, you can't undo this. But when it comes to... the second option that these women in the vast majority of cases have in the status quo is to have a child and regret it later. Recognize this is extremely problematic, because recognize that oftentimes, motherhood is just so much work. You're literally sacrificing 18 years of your life. Oftentimes it comes at the direct trade-off of things like your career. If you wanted to pursue a path of, for example, being a lawyer, you cannot be a full-time worker if you have to rear a child. And even if you get it later on, you probably cannot undo it. The second thing is that adoption, for example, is not an option. There is an immense social pressure that exists to not leave your child. And there's also a psychological barrier on the side of mother, because it's incredibly emotionally hard to, actually give up your baby to someone else. So that means these two options are not only irreversible, but also incredibly problematic in nature. That's why having these two options that are both equally bad, and being forced to rush into taking either one of the option by your parents, by your husband, by your doctors to make up your mind, because the biological clock is ticking, that you may not be able to no longer abort your child, right? So recognize when you're able to freeze embryo, you are able to delay that process. You are able to have more and more time to carefully think about what you're going through, therefore be able to make a better choices overall. So that means that we take this debate in the context of mothers who have a child, which is the only context that the opposition deals with. Let's secondly talk about the other context, which were entirely responded to by that side of the house. Because we told you from Sena's speech that the context in this debate oftentimes is that lots of career women sacrifice the entirety of their 20s for their work, and oftentimes do not have sufficient time to actually, get married, or, for example, to have a child in the first instance. But also recognize that the middle class, again, cannot have access to this technology in the status quo. So that means that given this option is particularly important. Do you have POI opposition? No? Okay. Now, I want you to recognize that we told you 4 mechanistic reasons to plausibly believe that this technology is going to be incredibly accessible to women, and for those also for those women who already have chronic diseases, for example, and then who have to go through things like chemotherapy, for example. This process of delaying that is particularly important, because those individuals are, when they get pregnant, for example, are forced to abort, and there's no other option for them. So that's why I think this is incredibly important. And I just want to note that flip side of this analysis is that there are many women in the status quo who think twice about pursuing a path of career when they are 20, and only become things like, a clerk instead of pursuing a path of becoming a lawyer, for example, because you want to have a child, and there's lots of social expectation for you to have a child. So lots of women oftentimes sacrifice pursuing the full extent of path of career in order to have a child, in order to conform to the social narrative. Now, if it is a case that we can get these technology to be increasingly accessible on our side of the house, we can get better options for those women as well, because we allow them to actually pursue the path however they want to. Now, recognize the fact that we identify the specific duty that the state inherently has to women in particular. We told you about the state's duty to, progressive social trend in general. We told you that state's duty to compensation for women, especially the fact that they're historically disenfranchised. But also we told you that oftentimes in private market, price gouging happens. This is a very critical option that women can have, and for that reason, I'm incredibly proud. First.
Thank you, Chairperson. Opposition explained that there are many risks for late-stage pregnancy. If so, why keeping the status quo is good for women? The previous speaker just proved the necessity of further research and development, so let's spare more budget to enhance technological advancement, and this is the logical conclusion of the debate so far, based on which I would like to answer two questions in this debate. One, how do we combat mental and physical harms for women? Secondly, how do we cope with corporate pressure? Because my partners have demonstrated the mechanistic process of how this technology generates biological benefits, I will spare more time for rebuttals and deconstruction of the case from the other side of the house. So first issue, how do we combat mental and physical harms? There are 4 responses to previous speakers. Number 1, the previous speaker explained that late-stage pregnancy is risky because of embryo's quality. Yes, that's the problem. That is exactly why we need to develop technology to reduce those risks. If we rely on market and private sectors, budget-wise, it is really difficult and impossible to create further quick technological revolution and reformation. That is why intervention by state in a large-scale research and development is necessary. Yes, we acknowledge there are some risks that the opposition have explained, but that's just a transitionary aspect of any technological wider application. We are, let's say, in analogies, in blockchain or AI or stem cell researches, state funded and invested in those areas. At the beginning, in 1 year or 2 years, there was some unknown risks, but in a long term, those risks were mitigated due to large investment and technological resource investment. And that's the kind of benefit and paradigm we would like to seek out. Secondly, there's some mental risks. We understand that, but that's not unique to the motion. Any pregnancy in general or any family planning in general come with a mental risk. I don't think that's a relevant justification to oppose the motion. Number 3, we gotta make comparison with the worst case scenario. Let's say, as my partner explained, that in case of abortion or adoption, there'll be much more mental harm and psychological harm to women, whereby prolonging pregnancy itself is much less mentally burdensome option. We need counter standard of comparison from the other side of the house. What alternatives are available then? That's the burden of proof of opposition bench. Number 4, even if there are some risks that we cannot mitigate, it's eventually up to individual choice. We believe women should be able to try options as much as possible. You can't call it forced choice. We trust the ability of individual women to take the best option for their life. We believe trust in the ability of women is the premise of current progressive social change, which directly clashes with the consent argument explained by the previous speaker. But the consensus characters in this debate is that the targets we are talking about care much about their future, body, life planning. They invest a lot, spare a lot of time and resources. I don't think those kind of individuals make decisions out of impulse. These people have the ability to consider risk and benefit. So creating the narrative that women can't choose the best option for them rather undermines the current liberal social change and progress. That is why we oppose the mindset and attitude of oppositions. We trust the ability of individuals and women to take the best option for their life and for their own body. They have bodily autonomy, they have ownership and control and autonomy of their own life. States should support and enable individuals to take the best option for them. And that's the best form of compensation for the past injustice that we perpetrated in the past. We failed to intervene to remove glass ceiling and many invisible barriers that women were confronting in the past. Now is the time for the state to take a drastic measure to remove those barriers and enable individuals to take the plethora of options for their life. Secondly, how do we combat and cope with corporation and corporate pressures? That's what Prime Minister explained. A leader of opposition explained. I think there are 4 responses. Firstly, there's a huge reputation risk for corporation if they pressurize or force individuals to take specific options in the context of cancel culture or Me Too movement, or there are massive consumer backlash. A corporation care about their reputation, how they are perceived in the market. Therefore, I don't think that kind of radical and extreme measure is going to be taken by the company's management. Secondly, shareholders pressurize management or corporations to comply with ethical standards so that equity and stock price won't go down. Let's say already shareholders pressurize companies' management to be strict about racial discrimination or sexual harassment or human rights abuse in the supply chain. We believe same kind of incentive would be applicable in this case as well. If a lot of women want to consider options carefully, the company have incentive to support that option rather than force them to do so. Thirdly, these days, a compliance section in human resources have a power and they are paying attention to many issues related to women and pregnancy, especially in companies in which a lot of many female workers are in a leader position like P&G and Netflix. They have incentive to protect their employees, their staffs in the same team. I don't think that literally forcing individual to do this option is going to be taken. Number 4, finally, if company encourage workers to try this option, that's a wonderful social change. Because nowadays, it's very difficult to get understanding from your colleagues. You need to spare a lot of time and resources. You need to take a holidays in Monday after 5 to visit hospitals. You need to visit medical institutions quite a lot of times to undergo this kind of surgery. It's mentally tough and time-wise very tough. It's very difficult for you to convince your team members and colleagues in the companies or the same workplace. But under our model, because of state funding, state publicly encouraging these options, the cultural normative change will happen. That means your friends, your family, your colleagues will better understand your career options and your private options. So the mental barrier will be reduced to a lot of women to visit hospitals, take leaves and holidays to undergo this kind of surgery, this kind of operations and medical process. Therefore, I think this is rather beneficial if the company encourages workers to try these options. We are happy to propose. Thank you.
I told you 4 reasons to plausibly believe that research and development allows more accessibility to these kind of technology, allows this to be incredibly accessible to everyone in the society. Given that we got no response, I think we can plausibly assume that this is actually going to be the case on our side of the house. There are 2 ways in which this allows us to win based on the utilitarian grounds against utilitarian rebel. Number 1, it's a conflation of timeline on the side of opposition. Opposition says, late stage pregnancy is incredibly risky. But this is a problem that only takes place only in transition period, as Mitsushi have demonstrated. Presumably, lots of women start taking, late stage pregnancy. That means that there will be more incentive, commercial incentive on corporation to actually try to develop this technology. Also, state instituted, research funds, for example, to actually do these things. So what I'm going to point out is that in the near future, research and development significantly diminishes the risk that they're concerned about, allowing women in the future, which are infinitely more numerous, to be able to have the best possible option for themselves. Secondly, Deputy Leader of the Opposition says, but we actually don't care about women's career. This premise of their argumentation is horrifically demeaning to the 50% of population, because they are essentially saying that women can't make decisions on behalf of themselves. As Mitsushi presumably demonstrated, it is their choice. It is their autonomy, and they are the only one that knows what they truly want. Now, opposition tries to frame this out by saying, we have proven structural reasons why women can't consent. So this nicely moves me on to this point about comparative, because this dismal lack of comparative on that side of the house, because lots of the structural reasons that they have talked about why women can't consent symmetrically applies to that side of the house. Also, the cultural forces that they have talked about, the fact that companies are going to pressurize. If that is the case, that's symmetrical both sides of the house. Now, even if we concede everything that these guys talk about and ignore everything we talked about, right? Let's ignore everything that 3 speakers we have talked about. Their argument in itself is self-defeating and they lose by themselves. The reason is the argument about coercion. When the alternative in the status quo is an option of abortion, and women are literally pressurized to take an option of abortion, as I have demonstrated in my second speech, that abortion oftentimes is incredibly psychologically traumatic. But not just that, the existence of biological clock on that side of the house forces you to rush into that decision and doesn't prevent women from making the best possible decision for themselves. That's why they already lost this debate. But secondly, I want to talk about why this technology allows women to make a very important and critical choice for their future. Now, in this debate, we have analyzed lots of actors, not just one actor, unlike the opposition, which only shouts, old women's pregnancy. We told you 3 actors. One is we talked about career women. Oftentimes it is critical to note that career women sacrifice their entirety of 20s and then oftentimes have to choose the option of late stage pregnancy, or for instance, or during the process, during their career and during their 20s, if they become pregnant, then they're presumably going to have to abort their child, or they're going to be forced to make a difficult trade-off between choosing your career, which you presumably love, or having a child, which usually social narrative pushes you to. So, the fact that biological clock forces you to rush into this extremely difficult moral trade-off is something that we cannot allow because this causes lots of psychological trauma. So I think principally we should allow more choices to women. Secondly, we talked about women with disease. This went entirely unresponded by that side. This is the kind of women who have absolutely no choice in the status quo but to abort, because in order to save your life through things like chemotherapy, you have to abort your child, because otherwise your unborn child is presumably going to die anyway. But the third action we have talked about is that women who are asked to make an extremely difficult trade-off at the age of 20 or at the age of 2020, whether or not they're going to choose the path of becoming a lawyer or to choose the path of having a baby, so sacrifice some of the career path in the future. So for all these reasons, we've clearly taken this debate.